Hello students, this is a video about transforming your trig functions, your sinusoidal functions, sine and cosine, um, by changing the equation. These are going to follow the language that we've used for transformations, where we have some translations because of addition and subtraction, and we also have some stretches and compressions because of multiplication. Reflections also happen, and the reason reflections might happen is because of negatives. Each of these functions begins with a leading coefficient. That leading coefficient, I should have a typo on here. I really should have said the absolute value of that leading coefficient tells you the amplitude. If that leading coefficient is negative, then we have, in addition to having an amplitude, we also have a vertical reflection. The amplitude for a standard trig function is 1 because each of your bumps goes up 1 and down 1. And so our amplitude will change that standard amplitude. The b value, when you're looking for the b value, you have to make sure that this is factored. So you have to factor out the b value before you can find c. So make sure that that's factored inside of the parentheses there. B is going to be a horizontal stretch or compression, and if it's a stretch, then it would be a fraction, so that would make the period longer. If it's a compression, then that would be a larger number, so that would make the period smaller. The standard period is 2 pi, so the way we get the new period is we do 2 pi divided by b. The phase shift is c, but again, in order to find the phase shift, you have to factor first. And then the d value is going to be the vertical shift, but it also works out to be the midline of the wave. So the standard midline is at the x-axis, but if we have a vertical shift, then our midline is moved to the new y equals d point. So we'll go ahead and do the first example together, and we'll also do the second example. When I do these problems, I like to start by graphing the midline, partly because that's the easy one. So the midline is going to be -2. That's also the vertical shift. So I'm going to graph the midline. I'm going to count by ones on my y-axis, so this is the midline. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to mark the beginning of the period. So the beginning of the period is going to be based on the phase shift. Normally I would have to factor, but because this is a 1 in front of that x, there's nothing to factor out. So my phase shift is horizontal. It's going to be not right pi over 4, it's going to be left pi over 4. It's a horizontal phase shift, so it's going to be horrible. So I'm going to mark the beginning of that period. I'm going to start right here. This is the beginning of one of my periods. Then I'm going to mark the end of the period. To figure out the end of the period, I'm going to do 2 pi divided by b. For us, b is 1, so that's just going to be 2 pi. My period is going to end when I get to 2 pi. But 2 pi from pi over 4. So here's pi over 2, here's pi, here's 3 pi over 2, here's 2 pi. This is the end of my period. Okay. Now I'm going to plot my 5 key points. 2 of my key points are going to happen at the beginning and the end. The other key points are going to happen halfway in between. So halfway in between these two would be here. And also a quarter of the way in between. So a quarter of the way would be here. And a quarter of the way, 3/4 of the way would be here. So I'm going to get my 5 key points at those values. So I'm going to use these. I'm going to plot those 5 key points using the halfway point and the quarter of the way point. I start, because it's a cosine function, I'm going to start at the maximum value. So when I'm at this beginning of my period, I should be at the maximum. The amplitude is 3, So the maximum is going to be 3 up from the midline. I'm also going to end at the maximum, so I'm going to go to that point. A quarter of the way in, I would be at the midline. So at this point, I should be at the midline. And halfway, I should be at the minimum. The minimum is going to be 3 down from the midline. My graph didn't quite go far enough, but I can just add a value down there, so that'd be -5. And then my last key point is going to be at the midline again, so this would be at the midline. So I just plotted those 5 key points. And then I want to connect those points with a smooth curve. So I'm going to swoop down and connect, and I'm making that smooth curve. So I'm just connecting those points. And then I have the entire graph, so I'm going to just repeat it using the period. So it would repeat from there. And that is my cosine function. The next one is going to be a sine function. We're going to start, this one we do have to do some factoring, so we want to make sure that we factor out the b. So I'm going to change this equation so it looks like -4 sine, and then I'm going to take the 2 out. So at 2x divided by 2 would be x, pi over 3 divided by 2 would be pi over 6. And then I have plus 1. Now that I've factored that quantity, now I can figure out all of my numbers. I like to start with the midline, so my midline is going to be based on my vertical shift, so it's going to be up 1, and so my midline would be at y equals -1, y equals 1. And then I'm going to graph my beginning of my period is going to be at -pi over 6, which I'm estimating where that would be. It'd be smaller than pi over 4. And then my period is going to be 2 pi divided by b, which is 2 pi divided by 2. So my period is going to be pi. So I'm going to go 1 pi away from there. This would be pi over 2. Here would be 1 pi. And I'm pi over 6 short of that. I'm also going to mark my 5 key points. So I'm going to go halfway, a quarter of the way, and a quarter of the way to get my key points. Now this is a sine function. The amplitude is 4. Normally I would start my sine function at the midline, and I'm still going to start at the midline. And I'm going to end at the midline. But normally I would go to the max, but because it's negative, I'm going to go to the minimum. So the minimum is going to be based on the amplitude, 1, 2, 3, 4, and it's going to be down here. And then I'd be at the midline again, and then I would go to the, normally it'd be the minimum, but I'm multiplying by a negative, so it's going to be the maximum. And so there's my one period of the sine function. And then I would repeat those periods over and over again to get my function. Okay. That is the down and dirty of graphing a sine and cosine function. These are called the sinusoidal curves. And please let me know when I get back if you have questions. Thank you so much. Bye.